Saturday morning. My private field. My land. Then a woman started charging people to park on it. Neighbors gasped. Anything like it. I just smiled and made one phone call. Deborah didn't notice the tow trucks lining up behind her. By sunset, her little parking empire was gone, and a secret ledger was about to end her reign for good. My name is Nathan Reyes. I live on the edge of Willowbrook Estates, on 11 acres my father bought decades before there was a subdivision, a welcome sign, or an HOA newsletter anywhere in sight. The field behind my house has always just been mine. I'm an electrician, married to Maria, and we're raising 2 kids who love running through that open grass more than any manicured park the HOA has ever built. I mow it, I fix the fence, I pay the taxes. It has never belonged to anyone but my family. The field wasn't always a point of tension. For years, when the town held its fall festival or the high school played a big home game, people would ask if they could park a few cars along the edge. I always said yes. 1. My father started that tradition before he passed, and I kept it going because it felt like good neighboring, not an obligation. Nobody signed anything. Nobody paid anything. The way things used to work before every gesture needed a policy attached to it. Willowbrook Estates itself came later, built on the other side of the property line in the early 2000s, long after my father had already cleared and fenced this field. The HOA that governs those newer homes has never had any legal claim to land that predates it by 20 years. Deborah Kowalski moved into Willowbrook about 6 years ago, and within 18 months she was HOA president. She ran unopposed the second time, mostly because nobody else wanted to deal with the paperwork. The meetings, or, as it turned out, with her. At first she seemed like any other overly enthusiastic homeowner, the kind who color-coded the community newsletter and measured lawns with a tape measure. People joked about it, because jokes are easier than confrontation, and confrontation was never anyone's first instinct with Deborah. Little by little, though, the jokes stopped being funny. She fined a widow 2 doors down for leaving her trash can out 4 hours past pickup. She sent a certified letter over a basketball hoop that had been in that same driveway for a decade before she ever arrived. People started avoiding eye contact with her at the mailbox. Not because they hated her exactly, but because every conversation seemed to end with her writing something down in a small notebook she carried everywhere, like she was building a case against the whole neighborhood. Since I wasn't part of the HOA, I figured none of it applied to me. My taxes went to the county, not to Willowbrook's reserve fund. My field wasn't listed on any plat map they controlled. I assumed that line in the dirt actually meant something. Deborah, turned out, saw property lines the way some people see suggestions. She began referring to my field in HOA meetings as the community overflow lot, a phrase I only heard about secondhand, from a neighbor who thought I already knew and was surprised that I didn't. I brushed it off the first time. People misspeak. Not a claim. I told myself that a woman who finds someone over a garbage can probably didn't have the nerve to try anything with land that had a deed older than her subdivision. Looking back, that assumption was the first mistake I made in this whole mess. I was judging her by the pettiness I'd witnessed, not by the pattern underneath it, a pattern of testing boundaries quietly before pushing on them with both hands. That spring, Deborah asked to meet with me, just to clarify a few community logistics. She showed up with a folder, clipboard, and a tone that suggested she already believed she'd won whatever conversation we were about to have before it started. She mentioned, almost in passing, that Willowbrook's original developer paperwork referenced adjacent parking accommodations for community events. I told her that sounded like it might be about the town park, not my field. She smiled the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "We'll look into it," she said, tucking the folder under her arm like she'd already made up her mind about what the answer would be. I didn't think much of it at the time. I had a job site to get to and 2 kids to pick up from practice. A few weeks later, at the neighborhood's summer kickoff barbecue, Deborah gave a speech about maximizing shared community resources. She never said my name. She never said field. But 3 separate neighbors came up to me afterward asking if I'd finally agreed to something with the HOA. I told each of them the same thing. I hadn't agreed to anything because nobody had actually asked me anything worth agreeing to. Their confused faces told me Deborah's version of events and my version of events were already drifting apart. And not by accident. My wife Maria noticed it before I did. She said Deborah had a way of talking about things as settled before they were ever discussed. Like she was laying track for a train that hadn't left the station yet, hoping momentum alone would carry it through. I should have called Deborah directly that week and put a stop to the ambiguity. Instead, I let it slide, telling myself I was being paranoid about a woman whose biggest crime so far was an overzealous mailbox inspection policy. That, too, would prove to be a mistake. By late summer, the town announced its annual Harvest Festival would be held at the park adjoining Willowbrook, the same event that always brought overflow traffic near my field. In past years, I'd wave cars in myself, chat with neighbors, and call it a good day. This year, Deborah volunteered Willowbrook Estates as the festival's official parking partner, a title with no legal weight but a lot of implied authority. She started talking about the lot in board meeting minutes that got emailed to every household on the HOA list, including several who weren't even attending. I found out what she meant by the lot on the Friday before the festival, when a neighbor texted me a photo of a hand-painted sign standing at the entrance to my field. It read, "Parking $10, managed by Willowbrook Estates HOA." I stood in my own driveway staring at that photo for a full minute before I even reacted, because some part of me assumed it had to be a misunderstanding. A sign meant for the actual park down the road, planted in the wrong spot by mistake. It wasn't a mistake. The sign was staked firmly into the dirt right at the mouth of my field, 10 feet from my own fence post, angled so drivers coming off the main road would see it before they saw anything else. Deborah was there herself, wearing a Willowbrook Estates polo and holding a metal cash box, directing a teenage volunteer where to wave incoming cars. She looked up at me like I was the one intruding, not the other way around. "Nathan," she said, as if I'd shown up to help. "We're expecting a big turnout today. This is going to be wonderful for the whole community." She said it with the confidence of someone who had never once considered that I might object. I asked her, as calmly as I could manage, why there was a sign on my property charging strangers money without my knowledge. She blinked, unbothered, and said the field had always been understood as shared community space, a phrase that meant nothing legally and everything to her. When I pushed further, she pulled a photocopy from her folder, a faded letter she claimed my late father had signed years ago, granting seasonal access consideration to the neighborhood. I'd never seen it before in my life, and neither, I was certain, had my father. The signature on that letter looked close to his, but something about the loop in the R felt wrong to me. A detail I couldn't quite explain in the moment but filed away anyway. The first small crack in a story that would later fall apart completely. "I don't know where you got this," I told her. "But my father never signed away access to this land. And neither have I." She smiled that same tight smile from our earlier meeting and said we could discuss logistics later, then turned right back to the cash box. Cars kept pulling in. Festival balloons. $10 at a time. Strangers were handing money to a woman who had no legal right whatsoever to collect it, all while parked on grass my father had planted before Deborah was even born. I could have made a scene right there, and honestly, some part of me wanted to. But with families walking past, kids excited for the festival, I decided yelling in a parking field wasn't the fight I wanted to have. I'd handle it the right way instead. That night, I drafted a short, polite email to Deborah and the HOA board, stating plainly that the field was my private property, that no agreement authorized parking fees, and that I expected the signage removed immediately. I hit send and told myself it was handled. Her reply came fast, almost too fast, like she'd been waiting for exactly that email. She thanked me for my input, said the board would review the historical agreement, and noted that festival proceeds had already been allocated to community landscaping, as if that settled anything at all. I forwarded her reply to Maria, who read it twice and said something I'd remember for the rest of this whole ordeal. "She's not confused, Nathan. She knows exactly what she's doing. She's just betting you won't do anything about it." Maria was right more than I wanted to admit. I'd spent years being the easygoing neighbor, the guy who let people park for free, who never made a fuss. Deborah wasn't testing whether the field was hers. She was testing whether I had a spine. The following weekend, the sign was still there. So was Deborah, in the same polo, with a slightly bigger cash box and a second teenage volunteer directing traffic. My polite email had apparently been filed somewhere between landscaping and ignored entirely. I confronted her again, this time recording the conversation on my phone, something I'd never normally do but which some instinct told me I'd need later. She repeated the line about the historical agreement, adding now that several homeowners have come to rely on this arrangement. "Homeowners who aren't paying for anything they own," I said. She waved that off, saying the fees covered administrative costs, a phrase so vague it could have meant anything from printer paper to her own pocket. And at that point, I genuinely didn't know which. A few neighbors overheard the exchange and, to my surprise, some of them sided with her, thanking me for finally letting the HOA use the field properly, as if I'd agreed to something rather than had it imposed on me without a single signature of my own. That was the moment I understood how effective Deborah's messaging had been. In her retelling, this had never been a dispute. It had always been a generous, settled arrangement, and I was the one now causing friction by objecting to my own land being used without permission. I left that second confrontation angrier than the first, not just at Deborah, but at how quickly a neighborhood could absorb a false story simply because it was told with enough confidence and repeated enough times before anyone thought to check it. Driving home, I decided this wasn't something an email or a friendly chat was going to solve. Whatever Deborah was building on my field, cash box by cash box, sign by sign, she intended to keep building it, and I needed proof before I could tear it down. The parking fees didn't stop after the festival ended. Deborah simply kept the sign up, quietly, For smaller events too. A church rummage sale, a youth soccer tournament, even a random Saturday when a moving truck needed extra space down the block. Each time, the same routine played out: a teenage volunteer, a cash box, $10 a car, no receipts given, no explanation offered beyond Deborah's now familiar phrase about community resource allocation, which had started to sound less like policy and more like a slogan she'd rehearsed. I asked around the neighborhood, carefully, trying to figure out where the money actually went. Nobody could say for certain. The HOA newsletter mentioned parking revenue exactly once. In a single line buried between a reminder about mailbox paint colors and a note about trimming hedges, Deborah began recruiting her own supporters within the neighborhood. Homeowners who genuinely believed she was doing something generous for the community. She'd stop by their houses personally, thank them for their patience, and subtly frame anyone who questioned the arrangement, meaning me, as difficult. One evening, a neighbor named Frank, a mild-mannered board member who mostly kept his head down at meetings, stopped by to smooth things over. He suggested I just let it go, that fighting Deborah wasn't worth the headache, that everyone eventually learned to work around her instead of against her. I asked him directly if he thought what she was doing was legal. He hesitated, glanced back toward the street like she might be watching, and said quietly, "I think it's easier not to ask that question," before changing the subject entirely to the weather. That hesitation told me more than a direct answer would have. Frank wasn't defending Deborah because he believed she was right. He was avoiding the fight because he'd learned, the hard way probably, exactly what happened to people who challenged her directly. A week later, I received a letter on official-looking letterhead, not from the HOA, but from a law office signed by a man named Gary Kowalski. Deborah's husband, turned out, was a practicing attorney, and he wanted me to know he was watching this situation closely. The letter didn't threaten a lawsuit outright, but it came close, using phrases like potential liability exposure and historical use precedent, in a way clearly meant to intimidate rather than inform. I read it twice and felt my stomach tighten in a way it hadn't before. I'm not a lawyer. For a living. Reading legal jargon aimed squarely at my family's land felt like being threatened in a language I didn't speak, which I suspected was exactly the point of sending it that way. Maria wanted to hire a lawyer immediately, and part of me agreed. But another part of me, the stubborn part one inherited from my father, wanted to understand the actual facts first, before spending money reacting to a letter designed to scare, not to inform. I drove to the county records office that week and pulled the original deed for our property, along with the subdivision plat for Willowbrook Estates. Reading through both, one thing became immediately, undeniably clear: our field had never, at any point, been included in Willowbrook's boundaries. The deed listed our parcel as recorded a full 19 years before Willowbrook's developer even filed paperwork with the county. There was no easement, no shared use clause, nothing granting the HOA or any resident access rights beyond what a good neighbor might offer voluntarily. I made copies of everything, tucking them into a folder of my own, and started keeping notes the way Deborah apparently did: dates, times, conversations, screenshots of texts from confused neighbors. If this was going to become a paper fight, I intended to win it on paper. Around this time, I ran into Linda Ferris at the grocery store, another board member, quieter than Frank, but sharper, the kind of person who noticed things and rarely said what she was thinking out loud. She asked how things were going with the field situation. I told her honestly, and she listened without interrupting, which was already more than most people in the neighborhood had offered me. When I finished, she glanced around the parking lot before saying, quietly, "Some of the numbers in our finance reports haven't been adding up either." She didn't elaborate. Not there, not then, but the comment stuck with me the rest of the day. If Deborah's field scheme wasn't an isolated overreach, but part of a pattern involving actual HOA money, this was bigger than one sign staked into my grass. I asked Linda if she'd be willing to talk more, somewhere private. She hesitated, clearly weighing something, then agreed to meet the following week, saying only, "Bring coffee. This might take a while," in a tone that suggested she'd been waiting for someone to finally ask. Before that meeting happened, though, Deborah escalated things further. She sent a mass email to the HOA distribution list, again, including households like mine that weren't even HOA members, announcing exciting updates to our community parking initiative, as though it were a done deal. The email described plans to formalize the field arrangement with regular weekend hours, a fee schedule, and even a proposed shared maintenance agreement, none of which I had agreed to, none of which anyone had discussed with me beyond that one folder and clipboard meeting months earlier. Neighbors began treating the plan as official simply because it arrived in an official-looking email. A few even thanked me publicly at the mailbox for finally getting on board, which was infuriating in a very specific, very quiet way, being praised for a decision I never made. I replied to the entire distribution list this time, plainly stating that no such agreement existed, that the field remained my private property, and that any implication otherwise was false. It was the first time I'd pushed back publicly instead of privately, and it felt overdue. Deborah's response came within the hour, calm and measured on the surface, framing my email as a misunderstanding of community goodwill, and gently suggesting that my tone risked damaging neighborhood relationships, as if my patience, not her fabrication, was the actual problem here. That framing worked on some people. A few replies trickled in defending Deborah, praising her tireless work for the community, while pointedly ignoring the actual legal question I'd raised. It was clear that facts alone weren't going to be enough to shift the narrative back toward the truth. Gary sent a second letter that week, this one slightly sharper, referencing Reliance interests the community had supposedly developed based on the field's continued availability, as though years of me being generous for free had somehow legally obligated me to keep being generous forever. I finally called a lawyer, a straightforward woman named Priya who'd handled property disputes for over a decade. She read both letters, reviewed my deed, and told me flatly that Gary's language was mostly bluster, designed to intimidate rather than reflect any real legal standing. "There's no easement here," she said. "No adverse possession claim either. Not with the timeline you've described. Legally, you could fence this whole field off tomorrow and there's nothing they could do about it." Hearing that out loud, from someone qualified to say it, felt like exhaling for the first time in weeks. Priya did caution me, though, that being legally right and winning a neighborhood fight weren't always the same thing, especially against someone skilled at controlling the narrative. "Facts matter," she said, "but so does how loudly you're willing to say them, and to whom." Armed with that advice, I decided my next move wouldn't be another private email. It would be a formal letter, sent through Priya's office, addressed to the HOA board as a whole, laying out the deed records plainly and demanding the signage be removed within 10 business days. I copied Linda on it, quietly, outside official channels, figuring she deserved a heads up given our upcoming coffee meeting. Her reply was 3 words. Good. Finally. Whatever she'd been sitting on about the HOA's finances, she seemed relieved someone was finally willing to push back. The letter went out on a Tuesday. By Wednesday afternoon, the sign at the field's entrance was gone, and for the first time in weeks, I let myself believe, briefly, that maybe this whole mess was actually, finally, over. For about 10 days, it genuinely seemed like it was. No sign. No teenage volunteers waving cars toward my fence line. Deborah even sent a short, almost gracious note to the board acknowledging some confusion around historical arrangements and thanking everyone for their patience. At the next HOA meeting, which I attended as an invited guest given the circumstances, Deborah publicly framed the whole episode as a misunderstanding that had been respectfully resolved, praising her own commitment to open communication without once actually apologizing for the fabricated letter or the fees collected. Several neighbors applauded. A few came up afterward to shake my hand, telling me how glad they were everyone worked it out, as though this had been a mutual compromise rather than me simply defending land that was never in question to begin with. I let it go. Mostly. I was tired, and Maria reminded me that peace, even an imperfect kind, was worth something after weeks of tension. We spent that weekend doing ordinary things. A birthday party for our daughter, a trip to the hardware store, dinner as a family without my phone buzzing with HOA drama. Linda and I still met for that coffee, though, on a Thursday morning at a diner 2 towns over, far enough that neither of us worried about running into anyone from Willowbrook. She brought a folder of her own, thinner than Deborah's, but heavier in what it actually contained. She'd been on the HOA Finance Committee for 2 years and had noticed discrepancies almost from the start. Landscaping invoices that didn't match vendor records.
A reserve fund that never seemed to grow despite steady dues. Cash deposits logged without corresponding receipts anywhere in the books.
I always assumed it was sloppy bookkeeping, Linda said, stirring her coffee without drinking it. But then the parking fee thing happened, and I started wondering if sloppy was the wrong word. Maybe it was just that sentence sit between us for a moment. I asked how much money we were potentially talking about. She shook her head, said she didn't know for certain yet, that Deborah controlled most of the actual bank access, and that Linda's own visibility was limited to summary reports the board received quarterly, not raw transactions. Still, even those summaries showed a pattern. Expenses that increased steadily every year, categorized vaguely under headings like community improvements and operational costs, with no itemized breakdown ever provided despite multiple homeowners requesting one at past meetings. Requests that always somehow got tabled. I want to be wrong about this, Linda admitted. I've known Deborah for years. But wanting to be wrong isn't the same as being wrong. And I think it's time somebody actually looked closely instead of just hoping the numbers eventually make sense on their own. We agreed to keep gathering information quietly, separately, without tipping off Deborah that anyone was looking. Linda would keep tracking finance committee documents. I'd keep my deed records and correspondence organized, in case any of it turned out to matter beyond just my own field. Driving home from that diner, I felt the calm of the previous 10 days start to crack a little. Whatever the sign removal had actually meant to Deborah, it wasn't an admission of wrongdoing. It was, I suspected, simply a pause, a tactical retreat rather than a real surrender. Linda's parting words stuck with me longer than anything else she said that morning. With Deborah, quiet doesn't mean it's over. It usually just means she's regrouping. I didn't want to believe that yet, but some part of me already did. The regrouping, as it turned out, didn't take long. 3 weeks later, a flyer appeared in every Willowbrook mailbox, including mine, announcing a new community parking partnership between the HOA and the High School Booster Club, sponsoring weekend game day parking at a designated overflow location. The designated location, described only as the field adjacent to Willowbrook Estates, was, of course, mine. Deborah had simply found a new institution to hide behind, betting that a partnership with a beloved school booster club would make the arrangement feel wholesome instead of what it actually was. This time, there was no hand-painted sign. Instead, a professionally printed banner appeared, complete with the Booster Club's logo alongside Willowbrook's, lending the whole thing a legitimacy it had never actually earned, since neither organization had ever obtained my permission for any of it. I called the Booster Club director directly, a friendly man named Coach Vasquez who seemed genuinely surprised to learn the field wasn't HOA property at all. Deborah told us she had it handled, he said. She said the landowner was fully on board with the arrangement. That phrase, fully on board, had apparently become Deborah's go-to phrase whenever she needed my silence to sound like consent. Coach Vasquez apologized sincerely and agreed to pull the banner immediately, saying the Booster Club wanted no part of anything built on a lie. Deborah wasn't pleased about losing her school partnership so quickly, and this time her response wasn't gracious retreat. It was pressure applied elsewhere. Within days, an elderly neighbor named Mrs. Alvarez, who'd parked her old sedan along my field's edge for church visits for over a decade, received a tow notice. The tow company Deborah had contracted claimed the vehicle was illegally parked on managed HOA overflow property, language lifted straight from her earlier flyer, despite the flyer technically being retracted. Mrs. 81 years old, was terrified and confused, certain she'd somehow broken a rule she never knew existed. I found out when she called me directly, voice shaking, asking if she needed to pay a fine to get her car back. I told her, as gently as I could, that nobody had any right to tow her from my land, and that I'd handle it immediately. I called the tow company myself, explained the actual property lines, and threatened legal action if her vehicle wasn't released without charge. To their credit, once they understood the situation, they backed off quickly, admitting Deborah had told them she was authorized to direct removals from that lot. That word, lot, kept surfacing everywhere. A small linguistic trick that made my open field sound like an official parking structure with rules, fees, and enforcement authority behind it, rather than what it actually was, private grass that happened to be convenient for other people's cars. Mrs. was released, but the fear in her voice when she'd called me stayed with me longer than I expected. This wasn't just about signage or cash boxes anymore. Deborah's overreach was now frightening an elderly widow over a parking spot that had never required anything from her before. At the next HOA meeting, I brought this up directly, describing what had happened to Mrs. Alvarez in front of the full board and a packed room of neighbors. For the first time, I watched actual discomfort ripple through the crowd, not just polite confusion. Deborah tried her usual deflection, blaming miscommunication with the towing vendor, insisting she'd never authorized removing anyone's vehicle without proper notice. But this time, I had the tow company's own written confirmation, forwarded by Priya, directly contradicting her version of events. Reading that confirmation aloud in the meeting was, I'll admit, deeply satisfying. For a moment, Deborah's composed expression flickered, a crack in the calm authority she'd projected for months, though she recovered quickly, pivoting to accuse me of recording private vendor conversations without consent. I hadn't recorded anything. The confirmation was simply an email, forwarded with permission, plainly stating what the tow company had been told. But accusing me of some vague impropriety was easier for her than addressing the actual harm done to an 81-year-old widow. Some neighbors began to see through it that night. I think, for the first time. Not everyone. Enough sideways glances toward Deborah that I left the meeting believing the ground beneath her control might finally be starting to shift, even if only slightly. Deborah didn't take that shift quietly. Within the week, my youngest, Sophia, came home from the school bus stop upset, saying another child had told her, "Your dad steals parking money from the whole neighborhood." A claim so absurd and so specific it could only have come from an adult first. I later learned, through Maria's careful conversation with another parent, that Deborah had been telling select neighbors a very different version of events, that I had personally been collecting parking fees for years and was now trying to cover it up by blaming her instead. It was a bold lie, considering the actual paper trail showed the opposite entirely. But Deborah understood something important about small communities. A confidently repeated story often outruns a quietly documented truth, especially when it's told to people who already like the storyteller. Hearing that my own daughter had absorbed some version of this lie, secondhand, from a classmate, was the moment this stopped feeling like a property dispute and started feeling personal in a way I hadn't fully braced for. Deborah wasn't just fighting over grass anymore. I sat down with Sophia that evening, explained as simply as I could that sometimes grown-ups say untrue things when they're trying to win an argument, and that our family hadn't done anything wrong. She nodded, seemingly reassured, though I could tell it had shaken her more than she let on. That night, after the kids were asleep, Maria and I talked seriously for the first time about how far this might go. "She's not just protecting a parking scheme anymore," Maria said. "She's protecting her image. And people protect their image a lot harder than they protect $10 a car." I brought the school rumor to Linda the following morning. She wasn't surprised. Unfortunately, "Deborah's done this before," she admitted. "Not this exact thing, but this pattern when she's cornered. She doesn't retreat. She redirects, usually by making someone else look like the villain instead." Linda also had an update of her own. She'd managed to review 2 years of bank statements during a finance committee session. And the numbers, she said, were worse than the summaries had ever suggested. Deposits didn't match reported dues. Withdrawals lacked consistent documentation entirely. "There's a gap," she said quietly. "Somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000, over about 18 months, that I genuinely cannot account for using anything the board has been shown." Hearing an actual number attached to the vague unease she'd expressed earlier made everything suddenly uncomfortably real. I asked if she planned to raise it formally with the board. She hesitated, said she wanted more certainty first, worried that accusing Deborah without ironclad proof would simply trigger the same redirection tactic, turning Linda herself into the neighborhood's next convenient villain instead. We agreed the smartest move was patience, gathering enough documentation that when the moment came to expose it, there'd be no room left for Deborah to spin, deflect, or blame anyone else. Felt slow, frustratingly slow, but rushing risked losing everything before it even started. In the meantime, the field situation kept simmering. Deborah, having lost the Booster Club partnership and faced public embarrassment over Mrs. Alvarez, shifted tactics again, this time framing herself as the victim of aggressive landowner behavior in a private Facebook group for Willowbrook residents. I wasn't in that group, obviously, since I wasn't an HOA member, but a sympathetic neighbor screenshotted the posts and sent them to me. Deborah described me as hostile, uncooperative, and unwilling to support basic community needs, language carefully chosen to make reasonable boundaries sound like selfishness. The posts got dozens of supportive comments. People who'd never spoken to me directly rallying around a narrative built entirely on Deborah's framing. It was strange, almost surreal, watching strangers form strong opinions about a conflict they only understood through one very motivated storyteller's version of it. I resisted the urge to respond publicly, mostly on Priya's advice. Don't fight her on social media, she told me. That's her home turf. With facts, in front of people who actually have to make a decision, not in front of an algorithm. That advice tested my patience more than once over the following weeks. As the Facebook narrative grew, painting an increasingly unflattering, increasingly inaccurate portrait of me to an audience I couldn't directly reach or correct. Staying quiet felt, at times, like losing by default. Deborah, emboldened by the online support, tried a new approach on the field itself. Without any announcement this time, she had a contractor install a row of small orange traffic cones along one side of my fence line. Improvements she later described as temporary community safety markers. I found them on a Sunday morning while walking the property with our dog. Cones planted a full 6 feet inside my actual fence line, clearly staking out territory for future use rather than marking any real safety concern that had ever existed on that grass before. I photographed everything, time-stamped, from multiple angles, then removed every cone myself and stacked them neatly by Deborah's own mailbox with a short note. These were found 6 feet inside my property line. Please don't place anything on my land without permission again. She didn't respond to the note directly, but 2 days later, Gary sent another letter, this one alleging I had damaged HOA safety equipment and created a liability hazard by removing the cones. A claim so disconnected from reality it would have been funny under different circumstances. Priya responded on my behalf, calmly noting that cones placed without consent on private property could themselves constitute trespass, and that any further safety equipment installed on my land without written permission would be treated as such. Formally, going forward, the letter exchange escalated the tension without resolving anything, each side documenting, each side threatening, while the actual field sat quietly in the middle of it all. Unchanged grass that had somehow become the center of a conflict involving lawyers, tow trucks, and now traffic cones. Around this time, a new voice entered the situation unexpectedly. Linda's teenage son, Marcus, mentioned to his mother that he'd overheard something odd while helping set up chairs for a Willowbrook board dinner at Deborah's house the previous weekend. Marcus said he'd walked past the kitchen while Deborah and Gary were talking quietly, and heard Gary ask something like, "How much is left from the field money after the booster club thing fell through?" And Deborah responding, "Enough. Don't worry about it. I've got it handled." It was secondhand, overheard, not something that could stand alone as proof of anything. But paired with Linda's missing $40,000 to $60,000 gap, it suggested the parking fees weren't just an overreach in judgment. They might be one small visible piece of something much larger and much more deliberate. Linda and I met again, this time with Priya present, laying out everything we had: the forged consent letter, the tow company confirmation, the finance committee discrepancies, and now Marcus's overheard comment. Priya took careful notes, occasionally asking sharp, clarifying questions neither of us had thought to ask ourselves. "This isn't just a property dispute anymore," Priya said finally, setting down her pen. "If even half of this holds up, you're looking at potential fraud, possibly embezzlement, on top of the forged document issue. That's not something the board handles quietly at a meeting." Hearing the word embezzlement spoken plainly, by someone qualified to use it accurately, changed the shape of everything in my mind. This had started as a dispute over $10 parking fees on my own grass. It was becoming something considerably larger, and considerably darker than that. Priya recommended we not rush to expose everything immediately, but instead build a complete, undeniable case, timed carefully, so that when it finally came out, there'd be no ambiguity left for Deborah to exploit, no room for her usual redirection tactics to work. That meant more waiting, more careful documentation, more quiet frustration while Deborah continued operating in the neighborhood as though nothing were wrong, still hosting board dinners, still posting confidently in the Facebook group, still entirely unaware of exactly how much ground had already shifted beneath her. I went home that night and stood at the edge of my field for a long time, watching the sun go down over grass my father had planted, thinking about how something so simple had become tangled up in forged letters, missing thousands of dollars, and overheard kitchen conversations. Deborah's next move, when it came, was bolder than anything before it. Overnight, without warning, a construction crew arrived and poured a short section of gravel roughly 40 feet into my field, laying the groundwork, quite literally, for what her flyers would later call a permanent overflow lot. I woke to the sound of machinery at 6 in the morning, threw on boots, and walked out to find heavy equipment already compacting gravel over grass my daughter used to do cartwheels on. A permanent-looking scar cut into land that had never, not once, been legally offered for this. The foreman, confused when I confronted him, showed me a signed work order listing Deborah Kowalski as the authorizing property contact, with an address matching mine, an address I had never provided to any contractor for any reason whatsoever in my entire life. That detail, my own address, used without consent, to authorize construction on my own land, represented a level of boldness I hadn't anticipated even after everything else. This wasn't overreach anymore. This was someone entirely convinced she could act as though ownership itself were negotiable. I halted the work immediately, called Priya from the field itself, gravel dust still settling around my boots, and within the hour she drafted an emergency cease and desist along with formal notice to the contractor that any further work would result in immediate legal action against both parties. The contractor, to his credit, apologized sincerely once he understood the situation, admitting Deborah had presented herself with such confidence that verifying ownership hadn't seemed necessary. "She had paperwork," he said. "It looked real. Fake something like that." "Neither had I. Really. Not fully. Not until that moment. Somewhere between the forged consent letter and this fabricated work order, Deborah had crossed from aggressive overreach into something that felt distinctly, deliberately fraudulent, calculated rather than merely careless or overzealous." Priya filed a formal police report that same afternoon, documenting the unauthorized construction and the falsified authorization. "It was," she said, "the first step towards something more serious than a civil property dispute. Something that might eventually involve criminal charges rather than just legal letters between lawyers." Deborah, confronted by an officer that evening at her own front door, reportedly claimed the gravel work was a miscommunication with the contractor, and that she'd meant to authorize work on the actual HOA-owned park entrance. "Not my field." An explanation that satisfied absolutely no one who'd seen the work order. Word of the police visit spread through Willowbrook faster than anything Deborah had ever posted online herself. For the first time, the Facebook group narrative began to shift without her steering it. Neighbors asking pointed questions instead of offering automatic support. Deborah tried to control the story anyway, posting a lengthy explanation blaming the contractor entirely, insisting she'd been targeted by a vindictive landowner determined to escalate a simple mix-up into a criminal matter. The comments, this time, were noticeably more skeptical than before. Frank, the quiet board member who'd once told me it was easier not to ask whether Deborah's actions were legal, reached out to me privately for the first time. "I think I misjudged how far this would go," he admitted. "I should have said something a long time ago. I appreciated the honesty, though it came later than would have helped." Still, Frank offered something useful. He confirmed that Deborah had, in fact, requested his help getting my address months earlier, claiming she needed it for official HOA correspondence related to the field. That detail closed a loop I hadn't fully understood before. Deborah hadn't guessed my address or found it accidentally. She'd specifically requested it from a board member under a false pretense, then used it to authorize construction equipment onto land that was never legally hers to alter. Frank agreed to put that admission in writing, a small but meaningful crack in the wall of plausible deniability Deborah had built around herself for months. Linda, hearing about it, said quietly, "That's the first board member willing to actually say something true out loud. It won't be the last." Deborah, sensing her control slipping, escalated in an entirely different direction. She filed a formal complaint with the county alleging that my fence, standing exactly where it had stood for over 2 decades, violated a setback ordinance and needed to be relocated immediately. County officials, obligated to investigate any formal complaint, sent an inspector out within the week. I walked the property with him personally, showing him the original survey markers my father had installed decades earlier, still visible, still matching the current fence line precisely. The inspector's conclusion was blunt and immediate. No violation existed. The fence had been properly placed since installation, and the complaint appeared to lack any legitimate basis whatsoever. He noted this formally in his report, A report Priya made sure found its way into our growing file. Deborah's willingness to weaponize government resources against defense that had never once been a problem told me something important about where her mindset had landed. This wasn't about parking fees anymore, or even the gravel. Really. It was about control, and about refusing to lose. I started noticing small, petty escalations elsewhere too. Our recycling bin reported as an eyesore despite matching every other bin on the street. An anonymous noise complaint filed the one weekend I hosted a birthday party. Each complaint traceable, eventually, back to Deborah's known patterns and phrasing. None of these individually amounted to much, but together they painted a portrait of someone increasingly desperate. Someone throwing every available tool at a problem that refused to disappear simply because she wanted it to. A portrait very different from the composed HOA president she'd once projected publicly. Maria, watching all this unfold, made a comment one evening that stuck with me. She's not acting like someone defending a misunderstanding anymore. She's acting like someone who knows exactly what she's done, and is terrified of what happens when everyone else finds out too. That observation matched everything Priya, Linda, and even Frank had separately begun to suggest. Whatever composure Deborah had maintained through the early months of this conflict was cracking under pressure, replaced by increasingly reckless attempts to regain footing that was already, quietly, slipping away from her. The county's fall festival returned again. On schedule, a full year after the original sign had first appeared on my field. This time, I fully expected Deborah to attempt something with the parking arrangement again. And I wasn't wrong, though her approach this year was bolder than ever. Rather than a sign or a flyer, she announced, at a public HOA meeting attended by dozens of residents, that Willowbrook would be formally hosting festival parking on community-adjacent land, carefully avoiding my name or any explicit property reference, while everyone in the room understood exactly which field she meant. I attended that meeting specifically to object. On the record, in front of witnesses, stating plainly that no such arrangement existed, that the field remained fully private, and that any collection of fees there would be treated as trespass and theft. Full stop. No ambiguity remaining. Deborah, undeterred, responded that the board had reviewed historical precedent and determined the arrangement legitimate, a claim resting entirely on the same forged letter I'd already proven, through handwriting analysis Priya had commissioned, did not match my father's actual signature on file with the county. I presented that analysis right there in the meeting, copies distributed to every board member present, showing side-by-side comparisons, my father's real signature from the original deed, and the noticeably different signature on Deborah's supposed historical agreement. Inconsistencies clear even to untrained eyes in the room. The room went quiet in a way I hadn't experienced at any previous meeting. Deborah's composure, usually unshakable, visibly faltered, her explanation growing tangled as she tried to suggest the discrepancy might be natural signature variation over time, a claim that satisfied no one holding the actual documents. Board members who'd stayed carefully neutral for months began exchanging glances. The kind of silent communication that happens when a room collectively realizes it's been operating on false premises for far longer than anyone wants to admit out loud, especially to each other. Deborah tried one final redirection, accusing Priya of fabricating the analysis, of being hired to attack a dedicated community volunteer. But Priya, prepared for exactly this reaction, calmly named the independent, court-certified handwriting expert who'd conducted it, offering his direct contact information to anyone who wanted to verify it themselves. Nobody took her up on the accusation. The silence that followed felt less like agreement with Deborah and more like a room quietly recalculating everything they'd previously believed about a woman they trusted, sometimes uncritically, for the better part of 2 years. Despite the visible shift, Deborah left that meeting still insisting the festival parking would proceed as planned, still refusing, even now, to fully back down. "We've already committed to vendors and volunteers," she said. "We're not canceling over a paperwork disagreement at the 11th hour." I left that meeting more certain than ever that Deborah wasn't going to stop voluntarily, no matter how much evidence accumulated against her. Whatever was driving her, pride, fear, financial desperation, or some combination of all three, it had long since outpaced any concern for facts or consequences. That night, Priya, Linda, and I met one final time before the festival, laying out a plan together. If Deborah intended to charge fees on my field regardless of everything already proven false, we would let her set up completely, publicly, in front of the largest possible audience. Then, once the field was full, cars parked, cash box open, we would end it decisively, all at once, with law enforcement, documentation, and undeniable proof present simultaneously, leaving no room this time for redirection, deflection, or another convenient miscommunication excuse. The week before the festival, I quietly arranged everything the plan required. Priya filed the necessary paperwork with the county sheriff's office, explaining the situation and requesting a deputy be present that Saturday, citing the prior unauthorized construction and forged document as grounds for concern. I contacted a licensed towing company myself, one entirely unaffiliated with Deborah's usual contractor, and arranged for several trucks to be on standby nearby, ready to move on my signal the moment the field filled with vehicles that had no legitimate right to be parked there. Linda, meanwhile, continued quietly compiling the financial discrepancies, now with nearly 2 full years of bank statements reviewed, the missing total climbing closer to $70,000 once she cross-referenced vendor invoices against what had actually been paid out according to the records. She'd also learned something else, almost by accident. While researching Gary's law firm for an unrelated reason, his bar license had been suspended 18 months earlier following an unrelated ethics complaint, a fact never mentioned in any of the increasingly aggressive letters he'd sent on Deborah's behalf. That detail explained a great deal. Every threatening letter, every reference to legal consequences, every implied authority behind Gary's name had come from someone no longer actually licensed to practice law at all, a bluff built entirely on a title he technically no longer held. Priya confirmed it independently through the state bar's public records, and the confirmation felt, honestly, almost anticlimactic after months of genuine anxiety over those letters. An unlicensed attorney's threats carried exactly as much legal weight as anyone else's opinion typed onto letterhead. I told Maria that night, and she laughed for the first time in what felt like months, not because any of it was truly funny, but because the relief of realizing how much fear had been built on nothing solid at all was, in its own strange way, genuinely satisfying. We spent the days before the festival preparing quietly, deliberately avoiding anything that might tip Deborah off. I mowed the field as usual, chatted with neighbors normally, gave no outward sign that anything unusual was coming, though inside, The tension of waiting felt almost unbearable at times. Sophia asked me, the Thursday before, if the parking lady was going to be mean again. I told her that by Saturday, things were going to be different, that sometimes people who act unfairly for a long time eventually have to answer for it. All at once, she seemed satisfied with that answer, in the uncomplicated way kids often are, and went back to drawing horses at the kitchen table while Maria and I exchanged a look over her head, both of us hoping the plan would actually unfold the way we'd carefully mapped it. Linda finalized her financial documentation that Friday, printing clean copies of everything: bank statements, invoice comparisons, the missing fund summary, organized in a folder nearly as thick as the one Deborah had carried into our very first meeting. Months earlier, back when this all began, Priya reviewed everything one final time, confirming the sheriff's office had the deputy scheduled, confirming the tow company understood the plan, confirming the handwriting analysis and property deed copies were printed and ready, every piece positioned like chess pieces before a decisive, long-delayed final move. Frank reached out again that Friday evening, saying he intended to attend the festival himself, just to see it through properly this time, an oddly formal phrase from a man who'd spent most of this conflict avoiding exactly this kind of visible commitment. I appreciated it more than I let on. Whatever guilt Frank carried over his earlier silence, showing up now, in person, willing to witness whatever happened, mattered, even if it came later than any of us would have preferred throughout the past several months. Deborah, unaware of any of this, posted one final update to the Facebook group Friday night, thanking volunteers for their help, making Saturday's community parking initiative a success. Language so confidently final it was almost impressive, considering everything quietly assembled against it by that point. I read that post twice before closing my laptop, feeling something between anger and pity, the strange mixture that comes from watching someone walk directly toward a consequence they've spent months actively building for themselves, one forged letter and false claim at a time. Saturday morning arrived clear and bright, the kind of perfect fall weather that draws every family in town toward the festival grounds. Exactly the large, public audience Deborah had always wanted for her parking initiative, though not remotely for the reasons she was expecting. I woke early, walked the field one last time before anyone arrived, running my hand along the fence post my father had set decades earlier, feeling something settle in my chest, a calm readiness replacing the anxious anticipation I'd carried through most of the previous week. Maria packed a small bag with our documentation folder, water bottles, and, somewhat practically, snacks for the kids. Since none of us knew exactly how long the morning's events might stretch on before everything resolved one way or another. Priya arrived first, meeting me at the edge of the field around 7, before the crowds, reviewing the plan one final time. The deputy was scheduled for 9. The tow trucks would stage a quarter-mile away, out of sight, until I gave the signal over the phone. Linda arrived shortly after, folder in hand, along with Frank, both of them positioning themselves near the field's entrance where they'd have a clear view of whatever unfolded, close enough to witness everything, far enough not to interfere before the right moment arrived. By 8:30, cars were already streaming toward the festival grounds, and sure enough, Deborah appeared at my field's entrance shortly after, cash box in hand, a fresh, professionally printed banner reading weekend parking $10 staked confidently exactly where the old hand-painted sign once stood. She looked, if anything, cheerful, greeting arriving families warmly, directing volunteers with practiced efficiency, entirely unaware that every single transaction unfolding across my field was being quietly documented, photographed, and time-stamped from multiple angles by people specifically positioned to capture it. Cars kept arriving, filling the field row by row, families climbing out with festival bags and folding chairs, handing over crumpled $10 bills without any idea they were paying a stranger for something that had never legally belonged to her in the first place. I watched from my porch for nearly an hour, deliberately staying back, letting the field fill completely, letting the cash box grow heavier, wanting the eventual reveal to carry maximum, undeniable weight in front of the largest possible crowd of witnesses. By 9:15, the field was nearly full, perhaps 60 cars parked in neat, informal rows, festival music drifting over from the park nearby, children running between vehicles, the whole scene looking, on the surface, exactly like the wholesome community event Deborah had always claimed she was building. The sheriff's deputy arrived precisely on schedule, parking unobtrusively near the road, waiting on Priya's signal rather than approaching immediately, allowing the scene to remain undisturbed just a few minutes longer while final preparations settled into place around the field's edges. I called the towing company at 9:20, confirming they were ready to move on my word. Engines already running a quarter-mile away. Drivers briefed on exactly what to expect. Waiting only for my signal to begin the process of clearing every vehicle from the field. Then, with Priya beside me, Linda's folder tucked under her arm, and the deputy walking calmly toward us from his cruiser, I stepped off my porch and started across the grass toward Deborah, toward her cash box, toward a confrontation months in the making. Deborah spotted me approaching and smiled the same practiced, confident smile she'd worn through nearly every previous confrontation, clearly expecting another round of the same pattern. My objection, her deflection, both of us eventually walking away with nothing definitively resolved between us. "Nathan, good morning," she said brightly, cash box still open beside her. "We're having a wonderful turnout today. I really think this shows how much the community appreciates having reliable parking during events like this." She hadn't yet noticed the deputy walking steadily behind me. "Deborah, I need you to stop collecting money right now," I said, calm but firm, loud enough for nearby families to hear clearly. "This field is my private property. It has always been my private property. And everything you've told these people today is false." She laughed, a short, dismissive sound, glancing toward the nearby families as if inviting them to share in her disbelief at my objection. "We've been over this, Nathan. There's a historical agreement. I have documentation. Time for this." "You mean the letter with the forged signature?" I asked, pulling the folder from under my arm and holding up the side-by-side handwriting comparison, printed large enough for nearby onlookers to see clearly. Her smile faltered, just slightly, the first real crack of the morning. "That's not forged," she said quickly, though something in her voice had changed, tightened. That's a legitimate historical document. My father's actual signature is right here," I interrupted, holding up the county deed copy beside it. "They don't match." A small crowd had begun gathering, drawn by raised voices and the unmistakable tension of a real confrontation unfolding in real time. Deborah glanced around, visibly recalculating, before pivoting toward her usual redirect. This isn't the place for a private property dispute, Nathan. There are children here. You're right, I said. There are children here, watching you take their parents' money for something you've never had any legal right to sell. I turned to the deputy, who stepped forward calmly. Officer, this is Deborah Kowalski. She's been collecting parking fees on my private property without authorization. The deputy asked Deborah directly if she had documentation proving legal authority over the land. She reached, almost reflexively, for the folder she always carried, producing the forged letter one more time, her hands slightly less steady than they'd been in any previous confrontation. The deputy examined it briefly, then looked at the county deed and handwriting analysis Priya handed over, comparing them without any particular urgency, the kind of methodical calm that made the growing silence around us feel even heavier than shouting would have. Ma'am, he said finally, this property is recorded under Nathan Reyes, with a deed predating your subdivision by nearly 2 decades. I don't see anything here establishing your authority to collect fees on it. Deborah's composure, finally, visibly cracked in front of dozens of witnesses. There's clearly been some confusion, she started, voice climbing slightly, but I have never acted in bad faith. Everything I've done has been for this community. Nearby, a woman who'd paid $10 just 20 minutes earlier muttered, loud enough to carry, then give it back. That single comment seemed to unlock something in the crowd. More voices joined, quieter murmurs turning into open questions. Several people pulling out their phones, some to record, others clearly checking whether what Deborah had told them matched anything close to what was now unfolding in front of them. Gary appeared then, hurrying across the field, apparently alerted by a phone call from Deborah moments earlier, launching immediately into the same confident legal language he'd used in every letter for months. This is harassment. Authority. I'd advise everyone to step back immediately. The deputy, unmoved, asked for Gary's bar number to verify his standing as counsel present at the scene. Gary hesitated, just slightly, before rattling off a number with practiced ease. An ease that evaporated the moment the deputy radioed it in for verification. The response came back within a couple of minutes, loud enough over the deputy's radio for those nearby to hear clearly. License suspended, 18 months prior, status inactive. Gary's face went through several expressions in rapid succession before settling on something between anger and panic. There's an appeal pending, he said quickly, though nobody in the crowd seemed particularly interested in the technicalities anymore. The revelation landed like the second domino in a chain that had already started falling the moment Deborah's forged letter was exposed minutes earlier. I gave the signal to the towing company, and within minutes, the first truck rolled slowly onto the field, its arrival immediately drawing every remaining eye away from Deborah and Gary entirely, toward the undeniable, physical reality of what was about to happen next. I addressed the crowd directly, apologizing sincerely for the inconvenience, but explaining clearly that the field was private property, that fees had been collected without authorization, and that vehicles needed to be moved so the situation could be properly, finally resolved once and for all. To my surprise, the reaction wasn't anger directed at me. Most people, once they understood they'd been misled, moved their own cars without waiting for the tow trucks at all, several apologizing to me personally for something that had never actually been their fault in the first place. One man, moving his SUV, paused to say, "She told us this was official HOA business. I had no idea it was your private land. I'm sorry, man. That's messed up what she did." Similar comments echoed across the field as families quietly, cooperatively began clearing out. Deborah, watching her carefully constructed morning collapse in real time, tried one final approach, appealing directly to the crowd. "Please, everyone, this is a simple misunderstanding. I would never intentionally mislead this community. I've given years of my life to Willowbrook." Linda stepped forward then, folder in hand, something she'd clearly been waiting to do for a long time. "Deborah, I think it's time to talk about where the parking money's actually been going. And not just the parking money. The reserve fund too." The crowd's attention shifted instantly. Deborah's expression, already strained, tightened further at the mention of the reserve fund specifically, a reaction sharp enough that even people who knew nothing about HOA finances could sense something significant had just been said out loud. "I don't know what you're talking about," Deborah said, though her voice had lost most of its earlier confidence, replaced by something closer to the tone of someone realizing, in real time, exactly how much ground had just been pulled out from underneath her. Linda opened the folder, holding up printed bank statements and vendor comparisons for anyone close enough to see. Nearly $70,000. Over 2 years. That doesn't match anything in the official records. I've been documenting this for months. The board needs to see this immediately. A board member near the crowd, someone I'd barely interacted with throughout this entire ordeal, spoke up unexpectedly. "I want an emergency meeting. Today. Until next month's schedule." Several other neighbors, previously silent supporters of Deborah, nodded in visible agreement. Deborah looked, for the first time since I'd known her, genuinely cornered, glancing between the tow trucks steadily clearing the field, the deputy still standing nearby, Gary's suspended license hanging in the air, and now Linda's financial documentation being passed hand to hand through the crowd. "This is a coordinated attack," she said, her voice rising now, genuine panic replacing the earlier composed confidence. "You're all twisting this. I have done nothing but try to help this community. And now you're trying to destroy me over paperwork technicalities." Nobody in the crowd seemed to agree anymore. The last few cars rolled off the field as the tow trucks finished their work. The grass finally clear again for the first time in what felt, to me, like an eternity of signs, cash boxes, cones, gravel, and forged letters stretched across an entire difficult year. Standing there, watching the empty field in the mid-morning light, surrounded by neighbors quietly absorbing what they'd just witnessed, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel yet. Not triumph exactly, but relief. The particular relief of watching a long, exhausting lie finally run completely out of road. The emergency HOA meeting convened that same afternoon, held outdoors near the festival grounds since no one wanted to wait for a formal venue. Nearly every homeowner in Willowbrook showed up, drawn by the morning's events and the promise of finally understanding what had actually been happening. Linda presented her financial findings formally this time, methodically walking through 2 years of discrepancies, vendor comparisons, and unexplained cash deposits. The same folder that had sat quietly compiled for weeks finally spread open in front of the entire community she'd been protecting by waiting. The board's actual attorney, a licensed one this time, retained separately by the HOA itself, reviewed the preliminary evidence on the spot and recommended immediate suspension of Deborah's financial access, along with a formal referral to the county for potential fraud and embezzlement investigation. Deborah attempted to speak in her own defense several times throughout the meeting, but each explanation contradicted either the documentation Linda presented or statements Deborah herself had made in earlier emails and meetings, contradictions the assembled crowd was now, finally, paying close enough attention to notice. A vote was called to remove her immediately as HOA president, pending the outcome of any formal investigation. It passed almost unanimously, with even her most loyal former supporters raising their hands, several looking visibly uncomfortable but unable, at this point, to justify continued defense. Frank spoke briefly during the meeting, publicly acknowledging his own earlier silence, admitting he'd suspected something wasn't right months ago but had been too intimidated by Deborah's reputation to say anything. It wasn't a dramatic confession, just an honest, overdue one, and the room seemed to respect it for exactly that. The county's investigation, once formally opened, moved faster than any of us expected. Bank records subpoenaed directly from the HOA's financial institution confirmed what Linda's careful documentation had already suggested. Years of diverted funds routed through vague vendor categories that traced back to accounts Deborah controlled personally. Investigators also confirmed the forged consent letter, comparing it against multiple documented samples of my father's actual signature, concluding definitively that the document had been fabricated, likely using an older, unrelated letter as a template for tracing his general handwriting style. Gary's suspended law license became its own separate issue, unrelated to the fraud investigation but damaging nonetheless. As it emerged, he'd continued sending threatening legal correspondence on official-looking letterhead throughout the suspension, a violation serious enough to trigger its own state bar inquiry. Neighbors who'd once defended Deborah in the Facebook group began quietly reaching out to me directly, several apologizing for comments they'd made without understanding the full situation. A wave of small, sincere corrections that, while appreciated, couldn't undo months of accumulated stress on my family. Mrs. once terrified over a towed sedan, stopped by our house with a homemade pie, thanking me for standing my ground, saying she hadn't felt truly safe walking near that lot since the whole ordeal began. Relief evident in how easily she smiled again now. Coach Vasquez reached out too, apologizing on behalf of the Booster Club for ever lending their name to Deborah's arrangement, offering, unprompted, to help organize any future community parking needs the right way, with actual permission, actual agreements, and actual transparency going forward. I appreciated the gesture, though I told him honestly I wasn't sure yet whether I wanted the field involved in organized community events again at all. Not after watching how easily good intentions could be twisted into cover for something this deliberately dishonest underneath. Deborah and Gary largely disappeared from public neighborhood life in the weeks that followed. No longer attending meetings, no longer posting in the Facebook group, their once constant visible presence in Willowbrook replaced by an uncomfortable, conspicuous silence that spoke louder than any explanation could have. Formal charges came roughly 2 months later. Fraud, forgery, and misappropriation of funds against Deborah. with a separate unauthorized practice of law charge filed against Gary for his continued correspondence during the suspension period. Both matters remained pending as the neighborhood slowly, cautiously began returning to normal. The new interim HOA board, with Linda elected unanimously as its president, immediately implemented full financial transparency measures, itemized reports, independent audits, open access to records for any homeowner who requested them, changes several people admitted should have existed all along. Frank stayed involved too, more actively than before, saying he wanted to make up, in some small way, for months of silence he now recognized had allowed the situation to continue longer than it ever should have been permitted to. I received a formal written apology from the HOA board itself, acknowledging the unauthorized construction, the false complaints filed against my fence, and the overall pattern of harassment I'd experienced throughout the ordeal, along with an offer to cover the cost of repairing the field where the gravel had been laid. I accepted the repair offer, mostly because Sophia missed her cartwheel space more than she'd ever admit directly, and within a few weeks, grass seed had been laid over the scarred section, slowly, steadily beginning to green again as autumn turned toward winter that year. Priya wrapped up her involvement with a final piece of paperwork, formally notarized this time, establishing clear, undisputed documentation of the property, boundaries on file with both the county and the new HOA board, ensuring no future confusion, intentional or otherwise, could ever take root here again. Linda and I stayed in touch long after the investigation concluded. An unlikely friendship formed entirely out of a shared refusal to let quiet dishonesty simply outlast everyone's patience. Proof that sometimes the person willing to keep documenting patiently matters just as much as the person willing to confront things directly. By the following spring, Willowbrook felt different. Not perfect, but noticeably lighter. Board meetings shorter and less tense. Neighbors speaking more openly, less carefully, than they had throughout Deborah's years of quiet, controlling influence over nearly every corner of community life. I still let people park on the field occasionally, for the town's spring market, for the 4th of July gathering, exactly the way my father always had, free, informal, a handshake instead of a cash box, though now everyone understood clearly whose generosity was actually being offered. Deborah's case eventually settled. Restitution ordered. A formal record now attached permanently to a name that had once carried real influence throughout Willowbrook. Quiet, unglamorous ending to a story that had briefly threatened to cost our family far more than just a strip of grass. Gary's law license situation resolved separately, unfavorably for him, closing out what had started as intimidating legal letterhead months earlier and ended as just another consequence trailing behind decisions made carelessly, confidently, by two people who genuinely believed no one would ever check closely enough to notice. Maria and I sat on the porch one evening that spring, watching Sophia and her brother chase fireflies across grass that finally, fully, felt like ours again. Quiet in a way it hadn't been in over a year. The whole exhausting ordeal finally, truly behind us. I think about that first hand-painted sign sometimes. Parking $10. Staked confidently into ground that was never anyone's to sell. And how something that small, left unchallenged, might have quietly grown into something much larger than any of us had ever imagined it could. What I learned, more than anything, was that quiet confidence isn't the same as legitimate authority. And that sometimes the most important thing you can do, against someone determined to rewrite the truth, is simply keep the real documents and refuse to stop asking for the facts. The field is just a field again now, open, green, unclaimed by anyone but us, and every time I walk it at sunset, fence line steady beneath my hand, I'm reminded that some things, however loudly contested, were never really in question at all.